This week, let's talk about the evolution of Jewish organizations responding to the Black Lives Matter movement. It's been a bumpy road, but an interesting one, as mistrust over Israel has given way to broad endorsement. As a warning, this episode is a bit more subjective, as I lay out some personal thoughts and reflections on what this shift means. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. So let's start with this. On August 28th, over 600 Jewish organizations, institutions, synagogues, and groups co-signed an ad in the New York Times that stated, quote, "We speak with one voice when we say unequivocally Black Lives Matter," end quote. From Jewish federations to day schools to political and service organizations, denominational groups, also Jewfolk Inc., the parent company of TC Jewfolk. It's really a diverse group of co-signers, and a link to the ad is in the podcast description. Now, you may be thinking, okay, so lots of Jews support Black Lives Matter, that's not really news. But from an institutional perspective, this is actually kind of a big moment, because since the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement several years ago, a lot of synagogues and mainstream Jewish organizations have had a tough time, to put it mildly, stepping out so publicly in support of BLM. A lot of this has to do with Israel. A lot of us Jews are Zionists or pro-Israel, or however you want to define the big feeling of being attached to the Jewish state. And we noticed every time BLM activists brought up Israel, which often was in the form of accusing Israel of committing genocide against the Palestinian people, or saying American police were so violent because they learned brutality from Israeli soldiers, and generally, out of all the countries in the world, singling out Israel for criticism in a way that veered into anti-Semitism. Naturally, singling out the only Jewish state in the world gives a lot of us the creeps, and it made many Jews very cautious about endorsing the BLM movement. It also didn't help that the Movement for Black Lives, which is a coalition of BLM activist groups, also accused Israel of genocide in its policy platform in 2016, which just left more Jews asking, what the hell does Israel have to do with the Black Lives Matter movement and American police brutality? What's going on here? What are we supposed to do about this? Fast forward to today, and that's not so much a problem anymore, as seen with this ad in support of BLM. But that big change doesn't happen on its own. And here's where I want to take a step back and give just my personal perspective on why I think this attitude changed. Why personal? Well, because what I'm about to say doesn't really have any hard evidence to back it up, and maybe there'll be like a great news article laying this out in a bit more of an authoritative way. But for now, it's just a comment on what I've seen, sort of since 2016. For a long time, Jewish organizations and Jewish professionals were really cautious. They tried to say that they support the concept of Black Lives Matter, but not make it seem like they endorsed the movement, because that would imply that mainstream American Jewish life was endorsing these anti-Israel activists and platforms as well. But there was also always a conversation, mostly coming from the Jewish political left, in my experience, that said just because there are elements of this movement that lots of Jews disagree with doesn't mean that Jews should disregard the whole movement, because it's not like every BLM activist and group was going out of their way to harp about how terrible Israel is. And the focus of the movement was and continues to be the systemic inequality and inequity in America. And no movement is perfect, so we can't really be absolutist about it. And I think that was a conversation easier in some ways for Jews on the left to have, because for many, their support of progressive values and movements was as non-negotiable as support for Israel's existence, for those that support Israel at least, versus in more mainstream liberal Jewish institutions, where I feel the mindset was more Israel is non-negotiable, and our open support of BLM, we can play with that a little bit. Now, I remember a period of time when there were a lot of articles and opinion pieces about the left-wing Jewish exclusion phenomena, stories of, progressive Jews trying to be involved in progressive movements like BLM, but who supported Israel and thus were driven out of activist circles. So when I say I think this was an easier conversation to have for the Jewish left, I mean easier in the sense that they were already engaged in figuring out the Israel BLM thing and rooting out anti-Semitism, versus established Jewish organizations that, again, I feel mostly tried to shy away from BLM or actively pushed the narrative that the BLM movement was inherently anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. Over time, though, that idea that anti-Israel elements don't mean shutting down the whole movement migrated to more of the Jewish mainstream. And that's probably because those people and organizations on the Jewish left who engage with both Israel and progressive movements never back down. They did the work of bringing a Jewish presence to progressive activism and challenging anti-Israel and anti-Semitic rhetoric in progressive circles, which I think taught other Jews that we didn't need to be so afraid, that we could carve out a way to support movements that we believe are good for America and keep our integrity while we support those movements. That, of course, also works together with the fact that in 2020, Black Lives Matter is just too big for Jews and mainstream Jewish organizations to ignore, and publicly taking a stand against the issues of police brutality, inequality, and racism is now non-negotiable. There is a larger conversation to be had about the performative aspect of publicly endorsing BLM, like, companies or even Jewish organizations advertising that they support BLM while having only white people in management. But it's still pretty interesting to note how far the Jewish mainstream has come and how much of that is, I think, legitimately thanks to the Jewish left, and really also thanks to Jewish progressives and organizations that are non-Zionist, anti-Zionist, or actively critical of Israel in any way, because despite their views, they also addressed anti-Semitism in progressive circles, including anti-Semitism related to Israel. And let's not forget that many of the Jews who paved the way for the rest of us are Black Jews and Jews of color for whom the Black Lives Matter movement was always non-negotiable, despite anti-Semitic and anti-Israel elements in the movement. Now, again, these are some broad views and generalizations and descriptions based just on sort of my personal experience of what I've seen. But clearly there has been a shift in the Jewish world when it comes to Black Lives Matter and progressive American movements on the whole. And I think it's important to reflect on why that is, partly because I think it's cool and interesting, and also because, honestly, the Jewish left and progressives are often ostracized by mainstream, more classically liberal Jewish institutions. And there's sort of a constant tug of war between the Jewish establishment, if we could say such a thing exists, and the Jewish left. And at the same time, there's this even bigger struggle in the American Jewish community to figure out how to make Jewish life inclusive, and how do we find room for so many different political and religious views among American Jews, particularly around Israel. And this is a fight that happens, in synagogues, on college campuses, everywhere. And let me just be blunt here. I often disagree with things Jewish progressives or progressive organizations say or how they approach certain issues. And I definitely don't agree with, a lot of the aspects of the conversation on Israel or anti-Semitism that sometimes certain groups on the Jewish left have. But none of that really matters in this case, in the sense that I think this story of the evolution of mainstream liberal Jews and Jewish organizations and the progressive cause of Black Lives Matter points to the fact that, first of all, maybe more Jews, we should thank our local progressive Jewish activists for the work they do and how they pave the way for the rest of us. And this story can help us rethink how and where we factor Israel into conversations about community, inclusion, and communal priorities. That pro-Israel organizations can still keep their integrity and engage with ideas and movements and groups that may not satisfy all of their checklists on Israel. Because here's what's maybe the most interesting thing to me about this New York Times ad and all the cosigners. Right after where the Anti-Defamation League is listed is a group called Anti-Zionist Shabbat. The ADL is a legacy Jewish organization that has worked to address anti-Semitism, bigotry, and hate in the United States and around the world, and it is a staunchly pro-Israel and Zionist organization as well. And again, it's listed right next to a group called Anti-Zionist Shabbat, who I'm sure do not share the ADL's support for Israel. And yet, There's room for the both of them to sit down at a virtual table and say, we're here because we support Black Lives Matter. That is important, and we're not going to shy away from it. That doesn't mean the Jewish community is done when it comes to advocating for BLM. This is just a New York Times ad after all. Let's not pat ourselves on the back too much. But again, I think this says something important about how the differing parts of the Jewish community can learn to make some peace and appreciate the work of people and organizations we may not always agree with. Relatedly, there's a link in the podcast notes to a piece by Aiden Pink, who recently left his position as deputy news editor of The Forward to become a rabbi. The linked piece is all about why he decided to leave journalism for the rabbinate, which is directly related to this idea of building community between mainstream Jews and the Jewish left. I highly recommend you give it a read. This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com.